Hello there, Richard from budgetkeyboardist.com. If you look around my studio, you're going to see I got something like 20 guitars, 3 basses, a banjo, a mandolin, not a mandolin. But for keyboards, I only own 3. The Yamaha MX88, Arturia Keylab Essentials 49, and the Casio CDP 100, which is currently sitting in storage. Yeah. Why so many guitars and so few keyboards? The biggest reason is that virtual plug-in guitars sound lame. I mean, the real thing is so much better. And believe it or not, every one of my guitars sounds different. They're kind of like golf clubs, you know? You need the right guitar for the right sound. A Strat doesn't sound like a Telecaster. But synth plugins are not lame. Many of them sound really good, right? I've got a pretty good collection of virtual synths, and I like them a lot. I made a video explaining why I prefer plugins to hardware synths, but if you don't want to watch that, here's a quick summary. Plugins are cheaper, they sound close enough, and the capacitors don't leak. They also happen to be easier to deal with in a recording in your DAW when you want to go back 6 months later and make changes. So why do so many people prefer hardware over software? The simple answer is that our brains prefer the hardware, but the reasons have to do with levels of abstraction and cognitive load. Okay, so I learned about these concepts as a programmer, and once you see what they mean, it's easy to see how they apply to keyboards. There are many different programming languages, right? And some of them are more designed for beginners than others. So one of the simplest programming languages out there is live code. Say you have a list of items separated by commas, and you want to sort the list in reverse alphabetical order. Here's what that looks like in live code. So sort lines of the text, descending by the last item of each. Even if you're not a programmer, this seems understandable. The only abstraction here is that the list of text items is in a variable named the text. Okay? Now here's an example where we use PHP to do the same thing. PHP is considered fairly easy to learn, and it's very popular with web programmers. Yep. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through this line by line. Let's just say that you need to come in with a bunch of background knowledge to understand this, right? You need to know what a $sign means, right? You need to know what functions are and what conditional logic is, and there's some other concepts you need to know. So having all of these abstractions increases the load on your brain, meaning the cognitive load. On my Yamaha MX88, there's a volume knob. Guess what it does? Yeah, there's no cognitive load associated with it. You turn it clockwise and make it louder. Counterclockwise is softer. Don't have to think about it. That's how volume knobs work. When we learn analog synthesis, we learn about oscillators, envelopes, filters, LFOs. When we get the basic concepts down, we can take most standard synthesizers and we can make sounds with them, right? And then beyond the basics, we get into more complicated combinations and things get a little more difficult. And at that point, we're either dealing with a bunch of patch cables, right? Or a bunch of menu diving. Patch cables are easier to work with in some ways because they're physical. You can see them. You can see what goes where until they get to be a tangled mess. But if you're menu diving in a keyboard, with a little screen on the keyboard, submenu, things get a lot more abstract. Because once you leave that submenu, you can't see it anymore. Submenus require adding a level of abstraction. I mean, we can do it, but for many of us, we would prefer it when we can see a knob or connect a patch cable ourselves. There's something very appealing about a synth where everything has a dedicated knob or slider. It's what most of us want, if we're being honest. And what's appealing is that it reduces our cognitive load by removing a level of abstraction. Okay, so now let's take the best case scenario for a plugin setup. I've got an Arturia Keylab Essentials 49 keyboard controller. I've got it connected to a Mac running Arturia software clone of the Roland Juno 6. Or is it the Juno 60? I can never remember. Arturia has tried to reduce the levels of abstraction here by using a design which looks just like the real synth. This is called skeuomorphic design. If I know how to use a real Juno, I know how to use the plugin. Better still, Arturia has already mapped many of the controls on this keyboard controller to work with the synth plugin. So I can either click the filter slider on the screen and move it, or I can move the physical slider on the keyboard. They've done everything they can to make it easy for me. But it's still not as easy as using the actual synth because the whole model of using a plugin is a massive level of abstraction. When you buy a hardware synth, you plug it in, you connect it to speakers or headphones, and you're ready. But the journey to get to where I am with the Arturia setup is far, far more complicated. First, you need a compatible computer, and you need to know how to use it. You need to know its operating system. You're also going to need an audio interface, and you're going to need some kind of powered speakers or headphones or something. Then you need to buy the keyboard controller. So now it's time to download, install, register, and configure the software, and that's not an easy, fun process. It's not. So once you've got the whole thing up and running, the final level of abstraction is that instead of just moving the filter slider, you have to take your mouse or your trackpad. You got to move the cursor on the screen until it's in exactly the correct position. You have to click the mouse button, hold it down, then drag at just the right speed to achieve whatever accuracy you need. Instead of just taking a slider with your hand and moving it, you're taking control of an input device, which controls a pointer on a screen, where you need to navigate the pointer to an exact spot and then click and drag using just the right amount of fine motor skills. Okay, admittedly, that makes it sound harder than it actually is. And no, it's not hard, but it does provide a level of abstraction that slightly increases cognitive load. Now multiply that by every interaction you have with any knob or button or slider, and you'll see that it is harder to use a plugin. It just is. But what about those pre-mapped sliders on the keyboard controller? You would think that that would be the perfect solution, but it isn't, because the slider mapped to the filter might be down already, like all the way down, but the plugin doesn't care. It has a patch where the filter is wide open. If you want to close the filter by moving the slider down, you can't. It's already down. So I'm going to need to move that slider up to trigger it to take control of the filter, and then I can move the slider back down in order for it to actually do anything. So the knobs and the filters do not show the actual status of the corresponding settings, and that makes them a heck of a lot less useful, honestly. Real hardware keyboards are just easier. That is, until you get into the third submenu down for one parameter out of 80 on a complicated patch. At some point, a software interface can make synth programming actually easier because you can see so much more on the big screen at the same time. A little screen on a keyboard isn't as user-friendly as a 27-inch 4K monitor, let's be honest. Programming my Yamaha MX88 is a little tricky with the software, but programming it through the little built-in screen is pure torture. Side note, most DAWs are designed to look like real mixing boards with real outboard gear. One exception to this is Ableton Live, which looks more like an interface to program your home sprinkler system. And I think this is part of the reason that people new to Ableton Live find it confusing. It sort of requires you to learn some different ways of doing things. But I would say, though, that once you learn Ableton Live, it is a great DAW, especially for electronic music. I use it live in my live setup, and I love it. So it's worth learning. Anyway, people will say that they don't want to use a computer because they're on a computer at work all day, and they don't want to go home and get on another computer. But I believe the real issue is caused by levels of abstraction increasing cognitive load. But if you're willing to put up with the increased complexity of the world of plugins, I believe the reward is more than worth the effort. And you can simulate $80,000 worth of vintage synths for about 600 bucks. If you want a huge variety of synths, plugins make that possible without paying crazy money. You know, that said, I really do want to buy an analog synth with knobs and sliders on it without a screen, no screens. One day very soon. I just want something simple, and I want to buy something new, not something 30 years old. But that's not going to cause me to give up my plugins. I kind of want both. And why wouldn't I? As always, thank you for watching.